Greetings, I'm Clink, Community Forester with the Holden Arboretum, and today we're here to talk about site selection of trees. We're going to actually plant a tree and then talk about maintenance and care of your trees. It's a critical piece for any homeowner, anyone that owns a tree, to ensure sustainable care of their tree, so I look forward to teaching you about tree care today. So in terms of site selection, we want to select a site that is both conducive below ground and above ground. One component of that is making sure that the soil is conducive to the tree that you're going to plant there. You can look at the soil's texture, you can test the soil. You also want to make sure that there aren't any utilities currently in place where the soil is. You can call ahead and make sure that your utilities are marked before you plant your tree. You also want to make sure that there aren't any utilities above ground. Considering the mature height and spread of the tree to other components of the landscape is also a critical piece in this process. All right, now that we've selected a site that is appropriate, we can look at our tree. Talk about aspects of selecting your tree for the site. We want to make sure we select a tree that has very strong structure. One central dominant leader, branches that are spread out radially around the main stem. We also want to make sure that the stock has a root flare present and visible at the time of planting. And again, picking a tree that's going to be successful in the landscape based on your needs. Are you planting a tree for shade? Are you planting it for backyard wildlife? Are you planting it to reduce heating and cooling costs? Are you planting it just for a sheer landscape accent? All these are important components in selecting a tree for your home landscape. So now that we've considered site selection and tree selection, we can talk about planting. We want to make sure at planting that our hole is twice as wide and that our root flare is at surface level or grade. And now we'll move on to actually show you the planting process. And now we're ready to plant our tree. Today we have a containerized tree, but there are options available. You can also plant balled and burlap trees and bare root trees. There's pros and cons to each of these. A lot depends on season, time at which the balled and burlap trees are dug. But for all those points considered, today we're going to plant this containerized piece. All right, so now that we're ready to plant, Charles here is going to help me get this containerized tree out of its container very carefully. So Charles is going to lift on the stem as I shake away and knock the container. You can set it back down. And one thing to consider with containerized stock is that you need to shave the exterior entresol of the root system. So we can do this with a saw. Any kind of retractable saw will work. You take your saw and you want to shave this exterior entresol away from the root ball. This helps to encourage new roots to grow and will limit the spread of any kind of girdling roots. So it's a proactive measure in hopes of sustaining the tree for a very long time in the landscape. And we'll just continue to spin it around, taking about an inch or so. And at this point too, you can take an opportunity to actually inspect the root system, make sure that there aren't any immediate girdling roots around the root flare and the main stem of the tree. Girdling and kinked roots can be removed at the planting process because they really limit the tree's ability to effectively move necessary foods to and from the roots and stem. So again, just breaking up the roots that are in place here in hopes of establishing the tree rapidly in the landscape. So Charles is again going to assist me. We want to make sure on the bottom of this containerized stock that there aren't any existing girdling roots as well. Thankfully, this one has been grown in an air pruning container, but a lot of your containerized stock won't have that. It'll have sometimes a circling dense mat of roots that are on the very bottom. So we just want to make sure one final step before we get this tree in the hole that we shave the bottom of the roots. So Charles is going to help me lift this up. We're going to grab the tree on each side, shuffle it into the hole, take a final check, make sure that the tree is close to grade. And from here, we're going to fill it in with soil to make sure that the tree is sturdy and in its place. All right, so now we have our tree in place. Charles and I have backfilled the tree about halfway to make sure that it's steady in its current transplanting spot. Also, we've watered this a little bit to help pack the soil, get some of the air out, make sure that it doesn't settle too much after we finish planting it. One final check before we finish backfilling it the rest of the way is to make sure the tree is vertical and well oriented in the landscape so that it looks aesthetically pleasing and will last a long time. We've finished backfilling our tree. The remainder of the soil has been lightly packed in around to make sure that the tree is stable in the landscape. But there are still some final checks that you can do to ensure that your tree is appropriately planted. One of those is making sure that the root flare, which is the point of transition between the stem and the actual root system itself, is at surface level or at grade or a little bit above. This will account for any settling that might occur with your containerized stock. And the final step after this is to check for any tags that might be up in the crown and finally give it a little bit of watering in. So it's important once you finalize planting to make sure your trees get an immediate drink of water. We want to focus the watering right around the root flare area again, and right around 5 to 10 gallons at planting. We'll talk a little bit more about aftercare watering. But you want to make sure that these trees get a good drink right away in the immediate vicinity of the root ball, so that the fine ephemeral feeding roots, or the roots that really are integral to the tree's health, are safe and protected and not incurring too much shock. All right, so now that our tree's been planted, we're going to stake or show an example of how you would appropriately stake a tree once it's been transplanted. Important considerations in staking your tree: you want to make sure that you use non-girdling materials, so plastic, fabric, similar to this here. Wood stakes driven into the ground in close proximity to the tree and then attached with some kind of non-girdling material to the trunk. Important to consider as well that you need to come back and inspect to make sure that even these materials don't girdle the tree. But this will help the tree to establish itself, not be too stressed out with wind shaking the root ball, and set down some new roots into the prepared planting hole. All right, so now that we have our appropriately planted tree, we've applied some mulch. We want to apply 2 to 3 inches of mulch within the drip line of the tree, or the area where the branches and leaves are. We want to take special care to keep it away from the root flare and the stem. Oftentimes you'll see what's called volcano mulching, where the mulch is piled up onto the stem, and this is an inadvisable practice. This encourages girdling roots, can increase insect activity and microbial activity that actually decays and injures the tree over time. All right, so we've covered a lot in terms of site selection, tree selection, and how to appropriately plant a tree, but there still are some critical components of caring for your tree long term, so we're going to discuss that further now. So caring for your tree requires watering. We want to make sure that newly transplanted trees get at least 10 gallons of water per week throughout the growing season. And that's just not a quick trickle. You want to make sure that you're out there when it's not raining so that the tree isn't going through long periods of drought. So 10 gallons of water, roughly you can use a container. One effective way, just taking the container up, setting it down along the root flare, the immediate side of the tree, and letting it water. Other options also include gator bags or even a 5-gallon bucket with a hole in the bottom. This allows for a slow percolating of the water into the root system, which actually is more available to the plant than if you were to just water rapidly. So really, an important piece is watering. So pruning your tree is another important component of aftercare. We don't want to prune at planting. It's sort of a misnomer and something that's been debunked over the years. Initially, we thought that pruning at planting was beneficial because you're compensating for root loss through removal of the actual tree's leaves and branches, but this is not advisable by any means. Once your tree is established, you can prune for structure, but immediately at planting, the only thing you really want to remove is dead, diseased, or dying branches, or anything that's really structurally unsound rubbing. But you don't want to take off a lot of the plant's living foliage, because that's what's going to help the tree establish itself in the next growing season. All right, so we've covered a lot today. We've talked about how to appropriately water, mulch and prune your tree. But there are often some other questions that come up, frequently asked, and one is, should I fertilize my tree at planting? And the answer really is no. You should at least give your tree a year to establish itself, and then from there we can provide some prescription fertilization. Also, in terms of watering, people often ask if a quick spritz is enough to water your tree, and the answer is no. We want to make sure that the tree gets watered frequently at frequent intervals throughout the week. So this is Chad Clink, Community Forester with Holden Arboretum. Please stay tuned for more videos or check out our website, holdenarb.org. Thank you.